Hi, and welcome to the Girlfriend God. My name is Kelly, and I'll be your host. Here we go. So, I wanted to talk to you today about. Oh, well, I guess I should probably start with some sort of introduction, right?
Yeah, you probably have it somewhere, or I'll send you my little bio blurb and you'll be like, here is Carla. She's amazing. She's incredible. Okay, now move on.
Well, what I was gonna say was, today we welcome Dr. Carla Ionescu back to the show. She was our very first interview in episode 2.
Yay! Very
And in
excited to be here
episode
again.
and in episode 2, we went over Carla's very long list of accomplishments. And yeah, so if you want to know all about her, go to the podcast description, and all of that will be in there, unless, Carla, there's something very specific you want to pat yourself on the back for. Because you should pat yourself on the back once in a while.
No, not yet. Not yet. I think everything has been submitted already and it's up there, but maybe in the future.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think what you're most known for people who follow this podcast is the Goddess Project podcast. So you guys that are listening in, you can find that pretty much anywhere. Just use the hashtag the Goddess Project podcast. So I initially reached out to you and said I want to do an episode about witchcraft and goddesses. So I was thinking this morning about, and really this is just kind of a rant about modern day witchcraft. One, I am old enough that when I learned about these things, I had to go, read books.
Right.
And
Right.
consult elders in these various traditions. And as I'm sure with the most recent wave of Neopaganism and witchcraft, that is very, very far from the truth. And in some ways, I think it's good, right? Because people are interested, but I get very offended when it's simply the witchcraft aesthetic rather than the actual practice.
Right.
And I think that people forget that the ancient history of witchcraft, and even the not so ancient history of witchcraft, really is about a spiritual practice. And that seems to have been overridden by this idea that witchcraft is just something to be used to get what you want. And I think that is not really what witchcraft was about long ago. And the goddesses that were part of that early witchcraft culture were to be revered and honored. And that's why when you look up traditional spells, it tells you what you give as an offering.
Yes.
Because you're asking for help with your spell. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about that. On the other hand, when I go on social media, I often don't listen because it's all the stuff I don't like. But you know what I mean? Like it's the difference between witchcraft as a practice and witchcraft as a religion. So
yes, it's funny that you say the word aesthetic, because I was just on TikTok and everywhere, and it's October and everyone is doing these TikToks of October and they're really witchy, and everyone's watching Hocus Pocus too, and everyone's into that, which is really lovely. Like, it's very beautiful. The aesthetic is beautiful. I love it. But you're right in the sense that there is a possibility that it becomes a trend that is sort of superficial, right?
Yeah, it's more about something you do as opposed to something you are.
Right. And you're right about this idea. I've also seen a lot of people with, DM me for spells and it actually worries me because I think that spell work is not something you should be playing with.
Agreed.
Right? You should be really careful with spell work. You don't just buy it off the internet. Like you don't just buy a chant and a recipe
Right.
and then go off and do it. Like that could get quite dangerous. So you're right. You're right a little bit there. I feel that way about neo goddess worship in a way too, and the whole love and light
And like
culture.
Neopaganism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great because it allows us exposure, but it does run the threat or the possibility that people that are like, you should have a leader or a teacher or a guru, or you should have someone that's sort of done the work that maybe can instruct you,
Right.
and not just buying it off of, social media. So I agree with you a little bit. I've been feeling that too lately. And now that Hollywood is picking up on it, I mean, I see witch films everywhere, which is
Right.
great. I love witch films, but they're fun. They're not like a practice, you don't copy a practice or
Right. Right.
create an identity from the films for yourself. It's more
Right.
like role playing or whatever, like fantasy, right? So yeah, I agree. And I think, but hopefully on a positive note, this will lead people to look up witchcraft maybe a little more in depth.
Right.
Maybe look at the goddesses, maybe concern themselves with the earth and the seasons. Like maybe there can be an
Right.
awakening,
Right. And I do see that. Like the people that I know that are other practicing witches, like Amelia, like that is her spiritual life. That is her religion. But that's kind of in stark and I'm sure that there are other people out there in the world. I mean, I don't want to just write off all witches under 30,
Of
you
course.
know.
Of course. No.
But in a way, I feel like, I mean, both you and I are all about, let's read a book about it. Let's do some
Yeah.
research. So it's kind of been a blessing and a curse that since the dawn of Wicca in particular, and, the Gerald Gardner and Scott Cunninghams of the world, yes, you made this information accessible, but all of those books should have had a disclaimer in the front that said, don't do any of this stuff until you have a teacher.
And maybe even a coven, like what's happened to the covens? Like I'm
There
not
are still covens, but
yeah, right.
I thought for a long time I wanted to be in a coven, and the one
Mhm.
experience that I had with that, I was like, there was a lot of hierarchy, which I understand that that's necessary, but if your focus is on that, I think this is why I left organized religion, because there were
Right.
too many fucking rules.
That's right. That's right.
You know what I mean?
That's
So
right. No,
so
yeah,
I've been a solitary
you're right.
practitioner for many,
Yeah.
many years.
And now that I think of it, to me, when I think about covens, but maybe this is more of a goddess worship format or structure. The purpose of joining a group is to have a circular, what's the word? I don't know, structure, right?
Right.
Where,
And like a flow of energy.
yeah, like you can have seniors, of course, like senior people who have been in the trade for a long time or in the religion for a long time.
Right.
And you can have some leaders, you can have some priestesses, but you're right. Once it becomes too hierarchical, it starts to feel too patriarchal. And then that's a
Right.
turn off for most of us. Yeah, you're right. It's a bit like finding your tribe, I think, that the way that people talk about, oh, find your tribe. I feel like it's that way too, spirituality or spiritually.
Yes. And I get that. And I'm a very community oriented person. But I'm also, I was going to say picky, but I'm not picky. I'm just discerning. You know what I mean? Especially now, because I am older and I
Yes.
do know more. And you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like modern day witchcraft is just all about do what feels right to you, which in a certain regard that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you're learning to work with your intuition.
Yes.
But if you don't know what you're doing, I don't know. It's like a catch-22, right?
It's a
It's
bit.
great to have that kind of freedom, but as we alluded to earlier, when you're working with these non physical, supernatural beings, you should probably know what you're doing a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
So,
And sorry to interrupt you, and the
that's
idea
okay.
that all of these beings are benevolent,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes. So, in terms of goddesses and witchcraft, I made a note for myself about source material, because there is a wealth of source material about goddesses, but we are so accustomed to now, if for non-researchers, if Google says it must be true. So I know that I have read things. I wish I could think of an example off the top of my head, but I cannot. I know that I have read things about goddess lore, that I've read it and gone, that is completely incorrect. And it's not like some obscure corner of the web either. It's like, within the first, I don't know, 10 Google search results, right?
Yep.
And the other thing I've noticed is, so this is a good jumping off point for a pivot. Because I've worked with a lot of different goddesses
Right.
in my witchcraft. I don't anymore,
Right.
once in a while, but and whenever I did, there's always, if you type in pretty much any goddess that anyone has ever heard of into Google,
Right.
you will get various and often conflicting lists of, these are the crystals that go with this goddess. These are
Yes.
the scents that this goddess likes. These are the colors that this goddess likes.
Right.
These are, the season, the moon phase, that whatever.
Right. Right.
And I think if anything needs to be accurate, it should be that.
Yes. Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
one of the things that Kendall told me, like there were incenses that you were not allowed to burn for particular goddesses, and other incenses that you could only burn for a particular goddess.
Correct.
So, I mean, I know that, so in goddess worship history, the whole, these are the things that correspond to this goddess, that's a real thing that we've always done. But I would highly doubt that a lot of what's out there now is accurate.
Yes. Yes. I think, and as you know, this is one of my goals in starting the podcast, but in also writing the books, is that there has to be a rooting in the ancient world. Like there has to be a rooting, there has to be a discussion, there has to be a learning before you can go off and do what you want, which is fine, it's wonderful. You have to have the knowledge of what you're doing, and then you can select what you want to do from that. And I had actually a couple of friends that were talking about working with Artemis in this spiritual space, and they said, it was a lot. Like it was aggressive. It was they felt like sort of like an anger or a rage, or like they were overwhelmed by the power they felt from this particular god, or from working with Artemis, and weren't expecting it. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, yes, that is to be expected, because this is a serious divinity. And they all are. I mean, I'm not saying any of them are not. I would say actually Artemis is probably one of the easier ones to handle. I mean, you don't want to get involved with Hecate or some of the other, maybe dare I say more darker divinities, or, that are going to come at you powerfully. You want to be able to know what to expect, to do the proper service for that. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a gap, a space that needs to be filled with a certain kind of knowledge. Yes. And a bit of work. Yes.
Yeah. I am listening to you. I did a Google search of Artemis and witchcraft just to
Yeah.
see. Let's see what this one is. And you can tell me if it's accurate or not. While Hecate is the goddess of witchcraft for both Greek and Roman mythology, not entirely accurate. I mean, it is, but
Right.
that's about Hecate, and I can speak to that
That's a
more
big
later.
umbrella. Yeah.
Yes. The goddess Diana in Roman mythology, or Artemis as she is known in Greek, is tied to one of the symbols most commonly associated to the craft. While Diana started out as the goddess of the hunt, she later evolved into the goddess of the moon.
Wow.
Yeah. That's the origins of Diana. I don't care about that. All right. Well, that was enough, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Kelly, now they say that I've been thinking about writing a book on the mistress of animals because I just see her everywhere. And I really think that she's sort of the precursor of lots of these aspects,
Right.
particularly of Artemis. And now that you read that a little bit, like it's just so, it's basic, it's superficial. And maybe that's fine if you're just kind of looking, browsing.
Right.
But we need something a bit more in depth.
So I'm looking at, I didn't even know this website existed. So I'm looking at the Wikipedia.
Oh.
And they say in Hellenic lore, Artemis was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And the twin sister of Apollo.
Hmm.
She was the Hellenic goddess of forests and hills, virginity, fertility, and the hunt. The during the cypress, it is said that Artemis was one of the most widely venerated of the gods and one of the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
Her later association with the moon is a popular idea which has little foundation, but may be related to her association with Diana. She became identified with Selene.
Uh-huh.
Artemis became identified with Selene. Correct?
That is correct, but it's complicated. I don't know where to start. The association with the moon and with Hecate comes from the Greeks and pre-Greeks. And so the fact that they say that that somehow came with the Romans, which are of course later, and with the transition to that, perhaps what they mean is that the Romans, when they took Artemis and made her Diana, they reconnected her in different ways. But Artemis was always associated with the moon and with witchcraft. I mean, her and Hecate are associated for a long time, and Selene as well. Yeah, it's a bit. So I think there's elements of correctness, and then there's just a few sort of disconnections that maybe could be made more clear.
Right.
That may be a bit misleading. You know what I mean?
Right. So this also
Yeah.
says, and I'm wondering if this is accurate. Artemis, the goddess of forests and hills, was worshipped throughout ancient Greece. Her best known cults are on the island of Delos, in Attica, or Broron, and a place I cannot pronounce in Sparta. The ancient Spartans used to sacrifice to her as one of their patron goddesses before starting a new military campaign.
True. That's true.
Okay. All right. Well, then I guess Wikipedia is fairly accurate.
Fairly accurate. Fairly accurate. Yeah. Yeah. Which is good. I mean, we want to trust the internet to some degree because it is the first point of access for mostly everyone.
Right.
But
right.
what I think people don't understand, like I posted this video on TikTok about Inanna Ishtar when I saw her at the British Museum. And I've gotten like 3 or 4 people that are like, oh no, this is Ereshkigal. And they're so aggressive about it. No, they got it wrong. It's a common mistake. And I looked up so I actually replied to them. I go, well, please contact the British Museum and the scholars that put this together, you know? And then they sent me a post of like where they got the knowledge that it's Ionescu, which is another goddess of Sumer, another goddess of the ancient world.
Right.
But I don't think that they realize like how scholarship works. Like, I don't think
Right.
that they realize that there is no one truth in a sense,
Right.
that there is more like an agreement of scholars, like the majority of scholars agree on this, therefore this name that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yes, there might be a couple of the scholars that disagree, and they might post something online, but there is no such thing as like 100% truth, right?
Right. Right.
And I didn't want to go into that debate on TikTok, but I'm fascinated by how people find a minuscule, let's say, person that says something different, and they go, no, 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 the whole thing is wrong. I
Right.
know because I found this website and it says this thing, and I'm like, okay, but there's decades of scholars and archaeologists that have done work on this. Have you read that? You know, so
Right.
I don't know how to overcome something like that. It's large. That's why I said my reply was feel free to contact the British Museum, because they, you know, and one of the people said I did contact them, and I started laughing because I could only imagine the British Museum being corrected by some individual. Oh no, you've got this information. Your entire existence and everything you've published about it is incorrect because I found this one site that says, you know, or maybe a few sites that say, and I didn't want to be mean, but I was like, I really don't think you know how scholarship works, and certainly how the British Museum works. You know, and Mary Beard, who is like the epitome of feminist scholars in Britain and England and in the, you know, I mean, she's incorrect. Anyways, it's just, you know, it's a lot.
Well,
And so I think
and
sometimes having
that's right. And that's why I always ask people when they want to tell me about some historical fact. I say, well, how do you know that? Or what did you, because if you can't tell me, you know, a legitimate source material that you're citing, then you're really just stating your opinion as fact.
yes, yes,
Or
yes.
what you believe as fact without any evidence to back that up. I mean, yes, there's such a thing as personal gnosis. I have a lot of that myself, but
Yes.
you know, some of the other stuff, I'm like,
Yes. But you
yeah,
can't pass that off as fact. Like, you know, I do, like, I feel that way too. Like you have a personal sort of where you know this is a truth for you.
right,
But I can't really pass that off as fact because there's no evidence. It's my own personal truth. I don't doubt it, but I don't want to publicize it as a fact. You know what I'm saying? Like that's
right,
right. So I could say it. This is my personal truth. But if I'm writing facts, then I'm going to try to go to primary sources, you know.
right. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that when you use the phrase primary source, they don't even know what you're talking about.
Oh, that's a very good question slash segue. You're right, because I've used it a few
but
times and people are looking at me weirdly.
right. But instead of going down that rabbit hole, so back to so this okay, so back to, you know, they would do this ritual or whatever with
Mm,
Artemis before war,
yes,
right? Or before
yes,
going to battle.
yes.
Is that witchcraft?
No, no.
Isn't it though?
The Spartans wouldn't think so. So that's the best I could do as far as close to a fact. The Spartans wouldn't think so. I don't think that, well, okay, hold on. So if we're asking, does Artemis require blood in order to offer you favor, then the answer may be a slight yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that's what you mean, yes, I sometimes think that she does. I mean, she did in the past, for sure, no doubt about it.
Right.
Am I going to give her some of my blood today? And I'm not really there yet. But in the past, she was definitely a bloodthirsty goddess. But I think for the Spartans, they didn't see it as a witchcraft in that sense.
Right.
But they saw it as definitely honoring her and gaining her favor.
Right. And that's what I was thinking about this morning, the kind of combine, because witchcraft is this very broad term that we
Right.
kind of tend to throw around because it's
Right.
such an umbrella term.
Yes.
But, so depending upon what you define witchcraft is, which you would think it would have occurred to me to look up the definition of witchcraft.
Right.
Um, but if it's something like, involving this belief in a goddess and doing things to appease her to gain her favor,
Mhm.
I would call that witchcraft.
That's a good point. I saw it somewhere. I saw somebody define it saying it's the use of like supernatural forces to create something that wasn't already there or something like that. So
Right.
in a sense, since Artemis is a supernatural force, or any sort of energy is a supernatural force, I suppose that if you are offering up your blood in order to activate that supernatural force to do something for you, yeah, I guess that is a kind of witchcraft. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So the very first thing that comes up when you search for the definition of witchcraft, which I believe is from the Oxford English Dictionary.
Mm.
See, this is a perfect example of the kind of shit that I'm talking about. And it's not like the Oxford English Dictionary isn't a reputable source, right?
Correct.
But
Yes.
the very first definition is the practice of magic, especially black magic, use of spells. Why especially black magic?
Right.
In a modern context, religious practice involving magic and affinity with nature, usually within a pagan tradition.
Ugh, that's
I would
painful.
I would disagree with that. I would
100%.
disagree with that.
Yeah. That whole definition pains me.
Right?
Yeah. It's very
And
old white Christian male.
yeah.
It's very
So
burn them at the stake, old white Christian male.
I'm looking for when that term actually first appeared. Do you happen to know the answer to that?
Well,
You
if we're
scholar,
talking
you?
about, yeah, if we're talking about like something like the pharmakai or the pharmakeia, which is sort of the use of magic, that could be traced back to the Greeks and pre-Greeks. So it's quite old.
Well, and didn't it kind of, when we were still like hunter-gatherer societies, it was the women who knew about herbs and planting and all
Yes.
of that. So I
Yeah.
think, I don't know, witchcraft as an idea, did it start with that they say that they synced their menstrual periods and they worked under the moon and they had this kind of what it seemed to be intuitive knowledge about what plants were poisonous, what plants weren't, how long things were going to take to grow. I mean,
Yes. Again, if you're using that definition that you are manipulating energy or something
right,
supernatural, let's say, blended with natural organic items to
right,
create something like healing or poisoning, then yes, I suppose one can argue that even back in tribal culture, shamanic practice was
yes,
witchcraft. And in fact, shamans often are like, that's an I don't have the vocabulary
eh,
this morning, but that's one of those words that's like shaman witch is the same thing, or shaman
right,
priestess witch seems to be overlapping words.
right,
Because they do the same practice,
right.
Yeah.
So we recently watched The Northman.
Oh,
Are
I've
you
seen it,
from?
but I've seen the commercials, but I haven't watched it.
So I'm trying to see when, like, what that time period was supposed to be. It was like Viking, like
Yeah, so
Viking age.
1400s to
Yes,
1600s.
yes. And when they are teaching uh the lead character, when they are teaching him as a young boy,
Hmm.
which he gets his training, he goes with his father into a cave. I know you like caves.
I
Uh,
do.
to be trained by the shaman.
Yes.
And somewhere in there, the shaman says to him, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but says something like, seek the counsel of women, but don't seek that knowledge, because that knowledge belongs to them.
I see.
Essentially.
Okay.
So I think that, those very, very early witches or women that practiced witchcraft were often, well, tell me if this is true, were often leaders in their communities and
100%. Yes.
and tribes and all of those
Yes.
things, because they had knowledge that men could not have.
Yes. Certainly before Christianity, I would say that they were the key connections between this realm and the supernatural realm. I think
Right.
women have always been the gateways or the gatekeepers to
Right.
that knowledge. Yeah, every now and then you get male priests who are initiated into that knowledge, but women tended to be seen as naturally connected to that knowledge due to the
Right.
fact that, they are the gateways of life. So yes, I think they were often leaders or people or teachers or people to be consulted,
Right.
like if, even emperors and like, powerful, let's say, people in patriarchy still consulted so-called witches or shamans or whatever, magic
Right.
women, right? Until Christianity, when they were completely, in fact, I think that's why the witch burnings happened, because the women were so powerful and trusted by their community
Right.
that the male leaders that came in needed to take that down in order to put themselves on that pedestal. And so therefore the murder of hundreds of thousands of women and some men
Right.
took place. Yeah.
I read somewhere, see, this is where I got to tell on myself. So I'm like half an academic researcher in that I do go look for source material, but then I fail to make a note of what the source material was so I could refer back to it later.
Right.
I will work on that, if nothing else, for the purpose of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But I read something that when they started making women's dresses, the reason that they chose to make women's dresses without pockets was because they were afraid of women carrying, herbs and other spellcasting
Ooh,
materials in their pockets.
that would not surprise me. Not
Yeah.
at all.
I'll see if I can find it and
Yeah.
append, make a note about it later.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I thought that was very interesting. And that goes along with your theme of that you talk about all the time. This, men have always been taught to fear
Yes.
powerful,
Yes.
independent, strong, not virginal women.
Yes. Yes. Always, always. And I think they're in awe of them, but also there's a fear there.
Right.
And I know, I mean, I think it's a certain kind of men that really destroyed that sort of, or want to destroy that power. I think that
Right.
certainly men who are in power feel challenged by that or emasculated by it, or
Right.
or men who want to come to power are certainly feeling emasculated or feel the need to control that. But yes, I think that men often talk about, I want a strong, independent woman, and then they get one and they're like, oof, that's a lot of work,
Right. Right.
and that's kind of like how it is with the goddesses. I think people approach the goddesses in awe of their strength and power and rage and etc., men and women, and then feel
Right.
overwhelmed by the power of that, or surprised, by the power of that.
Right.
So yeah.
And I was just thinking about, so in pagan mythology, especially now that that's kind of making a resurgence and there's this whole neo-pagan movement, Odin, like everybody knows who Odin is,
Right.
but Odin was given the knowledge of witchcraft by a goddess. Like,
Of course.
Freya gave him that knowledge.
Yes.
He didn't go out and find it. He wasn't, imbued with it. He had to go
Yes.
and or accept Freya's help.
Yes.
So,
And I mean,
but then if you look at the rest of the mythology around then, Freya is a very sort of minor goddess.
True. Very true. Very true. And if you think about even just Adam and Eve, the fact that Eve is the one that wants the knowledge,
Right.
and the fact that this becomes a bad thing is very much a purposeful aggression against the fact that women had knowledge,
Right.
and they've always been seeking knowledge, and that this now becomes a negative thing. The
Right.
whole curiosity killed the cat is literally anti-witchcraft, because witchcraft cats,
Right.
right? And because there's a curiosity of knowledge. So that whole statement is a warning to women, don't seek too much knowledge, right?
Right. Right.
Don't, you don't want to know too much.
Right.
God forbid that you learn too much. And I think the irony is that now women are seeking so much knowledge. And in fact, even at my university, it's like 70% women getting degrees now. Women are in positions of knowledge and teaching and all of these powerful positions, where there's a criticism, in fact, that men are dropping out of school, that young men are dropping out of university, that, the system is not working for them, et cetera, et cetera. I think women have always been seeking knowledge. This is not
Right.
new. It's just new to these generations, right? But always.
Right. So,
Right?
I mean, just while we're having this conversation, it occurred to me, because my master's degree is in library and information science, right?
Mhm.
And the stereotypical has always been that librarians are always women. Now, of course, that is no longer true. But I was just thinking, you know what? Maybe that was a good thing, because
Right.
we are the keepers of knowledge and information after
Right.
all.
Right.
So I wonder if that's, by divine design, that
Yes.
began as a career that attracted women,
Yes.
because we have that inherent thirst for knowledge, I think.
Yes. Yes.
So I feel like we're not talking about goddesses enough. So let's do some chit for chat about witchcraft and goddesses. Now, I can speak to you from my own experience of of being a practitioner of that. And I can certainly answer any questions that you might have, but tell me about, or tell us about, what you were thinking about before you knew that we were going to meet this morning.
I wasn't sure what we were going to do as far as witchcraft. It's funny that I'm talking so much about it, because I wasn't feeling like too knowledgeable about it. It's amazing how sometimes I'm like, I don't know anything about that. And then we start talking about, like, oh yeah, and then there's this and there's this. And anyways, I'm actually just recently feeling very connected to witches and witchcraft. I went to a retreat in May in BC with a bunch of witches, and it was just very, very familiar. And I really, really enjoyed it. I'm not a witch, or not yet anyways. I have explored some sort of connections with Crete, which are more priestess connections, like from a spiritual perspective. And so I'm kind of diving into that a little bit. What were the priestesses' responsibilities in Crete? I'm into Crete and want to move there. And so, but like we said, like priestesses and witchcraft sort of overlaps as well, although it could be a little bit different, depending. So I don't know. So I guess I wasn't sure what we were going to talk about. That's what I was like, so what would you like me to talk about today? But I'm very open to discussing literally anything. I mean, I teach the witch burnings of Europe. I do teach Salem, like in my classes. And so that's something I'm familiar with. So I thought, okay, if you want to talk about those kinds of things. And then, of course, Hecate, which is the queen of witches, to put it simply.
Right. And I was I was
which you're an
thinking about,
expert in anyways. Like you know, that's your boo.
well, I don't
Yeah.
know that I'd go that far. I was thinking about the book that you did for your book club, The Great Cosmic Mother, that the subtitle is Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth.
Yes.
And the book that I am so frustrated about because I cannot find source material, that scripture from the chapel of our Mother God, its subtitle is Scriptures of the World's First Faith.
Ooh.
So I don't know that necessarily has to do with witchcraft, although I think in the introduction, I'm paraphrasing, one of the authors was like, pretty much like, this is not about witchcraft. This is about serious spiritual connection with a goddess.
Okay.
Which I thought was interesting, right? Like,
Right.
mm, but maybe it was a similar, like, I buck against all this shit that's on the internet. These people were probably like, well, I mean, it wasn't on the internet because it was in the 70s, but I'm sure that the people that created that book were like, yeah, we want to disassociate ourselves with witches because, so here's the problem with witchcraft and goddesses. And of course, I'm making a general assumption, but I'm sure the opposite is also true. Most of the people that I have come into contact with who use goddesses as part of their witchcraft are really just using said goddesses as their errand girls. And I don't think
Oh.
that's how it's supposed to be. I think
Hmm.
that, like, in my spiritual life, and when I practice witchcraft using other goddesses, that number one, I have to remember, like, who's the mortal, who's the
Right.
mortal human, and who's the goddess,
Right.
and that I am trying to, with reverence and humility, ask her for a partnership
Yes.
rather than, hey Hecate, go do this, or hey Isis, go do this, or hey, you know what I mean?
I can't even imagine that language. I can't even imagine people would
Well, I
use
don't
that.
think they really say that, but that's their
Yeah.
intent, right? It
Yeah.
isn't
Yeah. Yeah.
about, I
Yeah.
respect you and the pantheon from which you come from and its rich ancient history.
Right.
It's more about, so I know what I know that I read about you on the internet, and here is what I would like you to do for me.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's tough. That's tough.
Yeah.
I think two things. First, what you were saying about this book, I think that people try to remove themselves or disassociate themselves with craft because it has that negative connotation. Like I even said to a few of my friends when I went away in May, I said, "Oh, I'm going to go hang out with witches in the forest." And you could see them, all of us raised Catholic, you could see them kind of take a step back and go, "Oh my God, what's happening to you?" Right? Like, what's going on with you? Like, are you getting lost in, are you being, taken by the cult of witchcraft kind of thing? You could see them almost trying to say that, a bit taken back. So I would like for the word witch and for witchcraft to start become a more positive, a more like any other sort of religion, let's say, or spirituality, that is something
Right.
that is, and people, fall. So that I think that's why a lot of people try to disassociate from that.
Right.
Um,
Well, and to some of the writers of witchcraft books, to their credit, they do make a distinct, especially Raven Grimassi, who
mm,
uh has passed away. He's no longer with us, but he wrote a ton of books about witchcraft and different traditions of witchcraft, like like this Traega that comes
the
from,
Striga, yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Um, but he and often in his introductions or forwards or whatever, he makes the distinction between witchcraft as a practice and witchcraft as a religion, because
right,
those are two very different things. Like, and I think what makes that distinction isn't that, we do different spells or use different ingredients or anything like that. I think the difference is the reverence with which we do it. Does that
Yes.
make sense?
Yes.
So back to
So
God. Oh, so I was thinking, I think your draw to witchcraft is because you know that it's rooted in ancient history, because
yes.
you know that it has to do with the earth, right, which was here before we were,
Yep.
and B, because women have been practicing witchcraft since before witchcraft was even a word.
Yes.
So
Yes. And I'll tell you a secret between you and me and everyone else that's listening.
don't worry, I only have like 35 people listening to the podcast right now. So
when I went away to Wales and we did this retreat, I had a really, which was just now, a couple of weeks ago, I had a really powerful vision, which I don't have visions. I don't have any of these things. Every now and then, like I said, of
apparently you do.
I maybe I do,
You
because
do
now that I'm
now.
saying it, of Persephone, who came and was saying things to me and called me a name, okay, an ancient name, and I kept saying to her, no, that's not my name. My name is Carla, and she just kept calling me like she was ignoring me. And then it was part of this ecstatic dance that we were doing. Anyways, it was a journey. The vision was so powerful that is still with me, and it's part of why I am starting to research priestesses in Crete, because this individual was a priestess in Crete. And now, long before this happened, when I first went to Crete and I had this visceral connection to the island, and I came back, one of the girls that does my acupuncture, she's also a spiritualist, and I was telling her about it. I go, I've never been to a place where I felt so connected, and she goes, maybe you have a past life there. So it started this kind of like, almost like the goddess is like shoving me a bit, or shoving people in my path to look up this stuff. And so I think when I'm with the witches, like I said, it feels familiar. Like their practices feel familiar. The nature feels familiar. The goddess honoring feels familiar. The drumming feels familiar. Right. So I'm going with that right now. Like,
because those
I'm just
are
kind of
really because those are very like primal instincts, right?
Yes.
That just feel right, and you never stop to ask why they feel right.
Yes.
I mean, and of course I have a couple of theories about that. One is, if I have that innately, either it's because I practiced such things in a past life, or I have other witches in my ancestry.
Yes. 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 It's that idea, that we are in our grandmother's womb before our mother's womb. It's that sort of idea of the womb and the ovaries and the memory in the DNA. So yes, I agree with you 100%. I think a lot of it is because all of us as women have that in our ancestry,
Yes. I mean, how could you not, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And perhaps even as men, the memory of attending rituals, attending festivals where women were leading, or women were priestesses, or women were oracles. Because I do have a lot of men that do come to the podcast or are interested in the goddess, and they come with very genuine like questions about, what does this mean for me?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly open to all men. I think that the interview you mentioned earlier, I think that C.G. Dolan is a total goddess devotee through and through. And his maleness has not prevented him from being that.
Exactly. And the goddesses certainly do not turn away worshipers or genuine people that genuinely love and honor them, no matter what gender they are.
Right.
Yeah. Even Artemis repeatedly asks men to build her a temple. She comes to them, and in fact, now that I think of it, and I don't know, this may be a patriarchal thing because men built things in the Greek world, but now that I think of it, almost every single sacred site for her that's built as a structure is a vision from a dude. So she goes to a
Right.
man and says, build me this thing, or
Right.
build me that thing, you know?
Right.
Not women. So again, I don't know if that could be like a Greek, of course, patriarchy thing where men built things rather than women.
Right.
But still, that implies that a man can honor the divine, and that the goddess does come to him and speaks to him, and so it's open to all genders.
So aside from Hecate, who is probably the goddess that is, or at least the well-known goddess that is associated with witchcraft the most,
Yes.
are there other goddesses that you know of that are associated with witchcraft?
That's a tough question, because my first instinct is to say, of course, Artemis, Persephone, Demeter. I'm thinking of the Olympic goddess at this point.
Right.
Because they are part of festivals, like women's festivals, that have to do with fertility rites, with renewal rites, with sacred
Right.
rites, blah, blah, blah. So I would say those goddesses right off the bat. There are, of course, goddesses like in the Egyptian pantheon, of course, Isis and Hathor, of course, Sekhmet. So I don't know, now that I think of it sounds like all of them, or many of them, Nyx, Neith. So I would say, now that you say that, it's an interesting point that many goddesses would be considered associated with a kind of witchcraft.
Right. And I think that's true as well, especially since, so something that I have seen is really popular in the neo-pagan movement is a revival of worshiping a lot of Celtic and Gaulish and Welsh witches, right? Because for years we only knew about Rhiannon, thanks to Stevie Nicks, but there are a host of other goddesses from that part of the world, and pretty much, I mean, so I read earlier that, I'm sorry, I'm digressing because I'm trying to talk about too many things at the same time. I read earlier that, I mentioned Gerald Gardner, who, as I'm sure you know, is considered like the father of Wicca. He said the witches' god and goddess are the ancient gods of the British Isles. And a horned god of hunting, death, and magic, who rules over an afterworld paradise, often referred to as the Summerland, and a goddess, the Great Mother, who is simultaneously the eternal virgin and the primordial enchantress, who gives regeneration and rebirth to souls of the dead and love to the living.
I mean, that sounds like so many gods and goddesses in one, really.
Right.
So yeah, I could see that. And this is why I think it's complicated to worship each goddess on an individual level. I think you can, but I think that there has to be, and this is why, again, with this TikTok debate that I've had, it has to be understood that these are multi-layered divinities. That there is no beginning or end to them. That they all, in a way, they all trace back to the very beginning and can be traced back.
Right. And I think a lot of witches today, they don't know, or they minimize or overlook the fact that a lot of the goddesses that they work with in their practice of witchcraft, those goddesses are kind of just like a mashup, an amalgamation of a whole bunch of goddesses that came before them. Like, I don't think in witchcraft community that there's a whole lot of, I wish that there were more of an emphasis on that.
Yes.
Like you can be super knowledgeable about a goddess and even do the kind of academic research that we do. But if you're missing the part that, she's not really just her, right? Like
Yes.
she was this in a different tradition. And before that, she was two of these. And before that, she was
Yes.
three of these. And you know what I mean?
Yes, this is the one thing that I have most people trying to correct me on. They will be like, no, this thing or this goddess is only this thing, And I'm
Right.
like, I sometimes do not have the patience, to be fair, to go into an entire explanation, because I feel like either listen to the podcast or like pay for my class, kind of, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
because I just feel like it's so over and over and over and over
Right.
again. And so I try to make it as public as possible, this idea that you cannot pin a goddess down. You cannot. She
Right.
refuses to be pinned. She sort of embodies whatever the hell she wants and how she wants, right?
Right.
Like, and she is interconnected to the goddesses around her and before her. So, you're worshiping her. Like, for example, I'm obsessed with Artemis. She is my boo. But I understand that there are multi-layers of goddesses that come with that, or sort of an umbrella effect behind her or
Right.
alongside
Well,
her, or, you know what I mean?
right. Well, I think you've heard me say that, in my spiritual practice, yes, talk to or worship or whatever these various aspects, but I call her the diamond god, right? Because she has all these different facets. Like you have Artemis and I have Ellen.
Right.
But Ellen isn't just Ellen.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, there
Right.
are things I will call upon her for if there's something very specific that I want or need help with. But I know that Ellen is just one very small part of a much greater whole. And I think
Yes.
that's where we fall into this, distinction between, using witchcraft as a practicality, like a lot of herbalism, right?
Right.
That's very practical. And using it in a way that is the basis of a spiritual life or a spirit, your own personal spiritual theology.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think that is the damage that monotheism has done to us.
Yes.
Because in the old days, pre-monotheism, people understood contradictions happen simultaneously, and two things can be wrong and right at the same time. Like they had a much broader understanding of the complexities of a divinity. A divinity could be good and bad at the same time.
Right.
Right. But with monotheism, we have been forced to think of divinities as responsible for a thing. Or maybe it's even the way that monotheism approached Greek mythology. And this was my issue with Stephen Fry. I think you saw my reel on Instagram.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of what's been happening is that each god has been given almost like a responsibility. And then they're stuck in that, right?
Right.
And what we're saying here actually is, and what I think we've been saying for a long time is, that's not the case,
Right. Like I consider myself a monotheist only because I believe that there is one source of power that is responsible for all other sources of power.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's that whole, those creation myths about, there was this darkness or this entity that had a consciousness,
right,
and became lonely and didn't. So, so she started with creating worlds and planets and the universe and the stars, and then was still kind of lonely. So, and it was too dark, right? So she created, oh, I wonder what light is like. So she created that. It was almost like as she thought of things, those creations instantaneously came into being.
Yeah.
Right. Including
she created her own consort.
Right. So like I said, I consider myself a monotheist in that way, that there's one true source that is the creator of all. And I don't even think that's a goddess. I think that's something that is so far beyond our human understanding.
Agreed.
It can't even be named. I mean, Yeah,
Certainly can't be
sure.
gendered. Yeah.
Right. Right. Like intellectually, I know that, I've always known that
Yes.
this non-physical, supernatural, all-powerful, all-knowing could not possibly have a gender, but part of our human condition is the way we interpret
Yes.
information. And I personally, I need a lot of iconography. That's why I've got all these altars around my house, and I'm making fucking Ellen pillows to sleep with at night. And you know what I mean? Because that visual
Nice.
is really key for me.
Right.
But in the same regard, there are things like I have to interpret, like I have yet to, and it doesn't mean I won't in the future, but I really have yet to have a clear vision of Ellen as she would look in a human form, right? I don't have a
Right.
clear vision of that. And I wish that I did, because when I'm kind of like in communion with her, I would like to be able to visualize that, but I don't know, like I said, maybe that's coming down the road. Um, so I'm going to take a sharp turn in a different direction. I was thinking about that article that I sent you from like the 1930s about the deer cult.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about goddesses and witchcraft from that perspective, because this whole concept of the mother, of the deer mother, of the, I don't know, just this reverence with deer and their association with a goddess that wasn't necessarily named, right? She's just the deer
Yeah.
mother.
Yes.
And kind of how that ties into one of those other things that people that practice witchcraft, they don't realize that it has roots in, that's not even ancient culture, right? That's more recent than
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
But that's where these things come from. Like I knew right away when I started to learn about Ellen of the Ways that she was associated with deer,
Mhm.
and particularly antlers. Um, and the focus on deer was on reindeer, because they are the only species of deer where the females have antlers.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but I didn't want to, work with her in a witchcraft perspective without understanding the where and why of the things that were associated with her.
Yes. Yes. It's true. Actually, I think you bring up a really good point, because I've always been drawn to the antlered goddess as well. But I think it's also important to understand, because we're missing it, to understand deer culture. I mean, deer culture is a weird thing to say, but
Right.
and to understand deers, because the people who worship these divinities lived with the animals, lived in the forest,
Yes.
understood
Yes.
their movements, understood their practice. That this was something that they didn't even think about. Where for us, I think we've been so disconnected from nature that we will worship a divinity and the animal that comes
Mhm,
along with her,
mhm.
let's say, or the animals that come along with her, but we don't really know much about the animals other than what we kind of see on Google. And so I do think that it's important to do some research on, it's why it's what drives me nuts about men who use alpha culture, and they're
Mhm.
like, oh, I'm an alpha, and I'm like, you don't know anything about wolves, like literally, you know nothing about wolves. It drives me nuts, it's like, or women who are like, oh, I'm an alpha female, and I'm like, you don't know anything about that. Actually, you don't know anything about wolves. Please go and study wolves before you name yourself an alpha, beta, omega, whatever
Right.
it is you name yourself.
Right.
And so I think that I've restrained from saying stuff like that to people, but in my mind, those are the first things that, or they call themselves whatever, and I'm like, we don't know anything about that animal.
See,
And
you are so much nicer than I am, because when I hear things like that, I I often say to people, I don't think that word means what you think it means. Because we're,
Yes,
you know, I mean, the history of language and etymology, like that's a whole other ball game, right? But I think at
yes,
one time we had a better understanding of the words that we use, whereas now we just kind of say them by default, right?
yes,
That's why
yes.
synonyms exist, right? Because whatever that thing is, whatever the word that was used to describe that thing and the house in which you were raised, that's the word
Yep,
that you're going to use.
yep. It's true. It's true.
So
It's true.
that was a that
No,
was a weird
I think
tilt, but
yeah, no, but I think I think we've touched on a lot of important aspects of the way that I hope the future of goddess worship and witchcraft moves forward. Like,
right,
and I think the goal that I have in mind for the podcast and for my work is to do that, like to be part of that, I don't know, learning or exploration. So that if
right,
people do need a reference or if they do need somebody to say, hey, I'm interested, this goddess feels like she calls to me, I'm going to look up some of her whatever, especially for Artemis. We don't get only hunt and forests and rivers. Like, dude, you don't want to access Artemis just with forests and rivers and then get whammed by the powerhouse that she is, a
right,
bloodthirsty goddess,
right,
Uh, yeah. Sometimes people say to me, how can Artemis hunt and be the protector of deer or animals? And I'm like, well, because those two things are not exclusive.
right,
I know
right,
we live in a vegan world, and I get it, but those two things are not exclusive to the ancients or the goddess, right? You
right,
can
right,
hunt and still protect the earth,
right,
right? I mean, we just have to look at indigenous culture for something like that, for example.
right, right. And I think that indigenous cultures have a much greater, there seems to be this thread of witchcraft going back to very ancient British shamanism.
Mm.
Like that's where a lot of our witchcraft practice came from. And yeah, I don't know where I was going to go with that. So
It's possible. And like
but
the
that is
druids and stuff,
interesting,
you mean?
right? And the
Mm.
druids, right,
Yes,
right. That has had
right.
a druidry has had a real resurgence in the neo-pagan movement.
Yes, I've seen it. Yes, yes. Yeah, which is
So
good, but also again, you got to educate yourself.
right.
Yeah.
So based on what you know as a researcher, is what you see out there in the world, does that point to a resurgence of goddess worship and feminine divinity focused and matriarchal community? And like, do you see humanity kind of headed in that direction?
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
So I've been with the goddess, I'm sure as you have for, at least 20 years. And I've never seen this level of young interest
Yes.
and young question and young openness. Actually, it's not just interest, it's openness. Like when I used to talk about the goddess 10 years ago in classes, people were not as open to or curious about, or they kind of went, oh yeah, that's like fairy tales of the old days. There was a bit of a resistance, maybe even, or whatever. But now there is such an openness, and almost like they took the ball and ran with it, to the point that, like, would I had done this podcast, 5 years ago? I don't know. It felt
Right.
like the call was now, because, and in many ways it was inspired about my students, because we would have conversations now in the last couple of years that felt unfinished. And so I was like, oh, I really want to talk about that,
Right.
you know? Um,
And it's interesting that you refer to it as the call, because I feel very similarly about why I created the girlfriend god, right? It
mhm.
wasn't to preach or to just to be ego driven and talk about my own experience. It was meant to, like, you want me to tell people about you? Okay. You know what I mean? It was like that. And
Yeah.
in my spiritual practice, I mean, I consider myself a very creative person, but everything that I create is like an offering to her,
Yes.
because
Yes.
without her, because I would not have creativity without
Yes.
her. I would not have
Yes.
any of my uh you know personality traits or gifts or talents or even my shortcomings without her.
Yes.
So I don't know. I keep coming back to that, in witchcraft of today, I think what is severely lacking is a reverence.
Yes. Yes.
Reverence to the goddesses that you work with or that you call upon in your witchcraft, rather than just calling upon them because you think that they're going to help and do your bidding.
And perhaps this is perhaps this is because we come out of trauma of patriarchy, perhaps because one of the things that I see too is there's a lot of love and light emphasis,
Right.
and always like stay away from negativity, stay away from this, and I feel like that is a reaction to the trauma. That is, you are seeking a haven with the goddesses, perhaps
Right.
because they assume a type of mothering, perhaps because they assume a type of feminine kindness, which it is there to some degree. So maybe it's just the first step, in the sense
Right.
of like, it's the first step away from patriarchy. And so you're walking literally into love and light. You're walking towards love and light.
Right.
And then you may be surprised, and perhaps actually I've seen people talk about this, that when as you step into love and light, you start to feel the anger, the rage, the resentment of having lived the trauma, right? So that's part of trauma process.
Right.
So perhaps that will be sort of the next phase, and then the goddess's anger and rage will empower you, or hold you while you go through that
Right.
rage.
I mean, that is certainly what brought me to having this, these very intimate relationships with the goddess, is because that came from a place of need when I was hurting and swore I never hurt so bad in my whole life. And you know what I mean? And then once I made that connection, I was like, oh, this can really help me. This can really help me. So, I mean, one place in which, like you were just talking about, like you can't have one without the other, and the yin and yang and all of that. That is somewhere where I think modern day witchcraft got it right? Because there's a lot of emphasis on that.
Yes.
A lot of emphasis on that. But I think where it falters a little bit is people assume that in the interest of that balance, you have to have a female and male divinity.
Right.
That's what Wicca was about, right? It was never about just the goddess until Dianic Wicca. But from what I understand about Dianic Wiccans, they're fairly militant about their feminism, and that's not really my bag. And I'm making a generalization that I don't know any but Dianic witches, so I can't really speak to that. But there is an emphasis in witchcraft of today, and where it gets skewed is, like, I had someone ask me about my practice. Where is you're telling me about these things that you use in your witchcraft. Where is your male energy? And I'm like, she is also bringing that male energy. I don't need an additional deity to be thrown into the mix. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I guess that, focus on, you got to have both is both a good thing and a bad thing, right?
It is. I was I participated in a meditation for I can't remember the name of the school or the place that was holding it, but it was a meditation about women's wombs and the new moon or the full moon, etc. Anyways, and one of the things that the leader, the woman who was running the meditation, had brought in is, again, this masculine, like, we have to welcome the mother of whatever and then the king of whatever. And I did feel resistance to that. I felt a little bit like, and perhaps that's coming out of my own sort of past, where I want to be in a space that is female only, but I believe that in that space you can have a feminine and masculine because we have it inside us.
Right.
Like, I feel
right.
like
I mean,
my
that's in our
everyday
DNA.
life, right? Like, I think it takes me a lot of masculinity to get through my everyday life, to teach, to work, to pay bills, to,
Right.
Run a family, run a business, run whatever.
And
There's a lot
it's
of
that
that
logical
masculine.
side that you have to have.
Right.
Right. Because logic is often associated with,
Right.
masculinity is where we are supposed to be more emotional.
That's right. That's right. That's sort of,
But
I
I
think,
think
right.
that's true to some, I think that's true to some degree.
Yeah.
There was something else I was going to ask you about, but then I, did that thing that I do where I interrupt myself.
No, it's
I often interrupt myself, but because the thoughts in my head move faster than my mouth. I'm sure that you could. Well, no, I'm
totally
not
get
sure. I
that.
have a feeling you can relate to that. Yeah,
Totally get that. Totally.
because I listen to you talk and I think, oh, she has that problem too.
Yes, especially when I pause. I'm so glad that people have come back and commented and said, I really like it that it's unedited, because I always feel like a bit self-conscious about the fact that I pause. It takes me a minute to reorganize my thoughts or to pause my thoughts. And so, but so far people have enjoyed it. So I was like, okay, this is okay.
It is
Because
okay. And when I did the interview with Kendall, and when she listened to it before I posted it yesterday morning, she said, "Oh my God, I say so much." And I said, "Yeah, but I
right.
think that for both for my podcast and for yours, part of the genuineness of that is that they aren't
Yes.
polished or heavily
Yes.
edited or
Yes. I want it to sound like a conversation. I really do.
yes.
I don't want to
Same.
come down as like I am lecturing you now, because I lecture all the time,
Right.
and especially,
I'm not
yeah,
an expert in anything except my own spiritual experience.
yeah. And
Because
I
it's
feel
my spiritual experience.
that's right. And that's what people
Right?
want to connect to, right? Like that's
Right.
right. That's the connection. And I do
So
that with my students too.
I was going to say, and you've heard me say this before, that I think that, like this is the last iteration of this us, right? She's going to wipe us off the board, start over again. And I think that there are a few things that she's like, next time, okay, social construct of gender, let's not let them do that this time. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like the worst religious teaching we have been given, or spiritual teaching, is that you have free will. Sometimes I think
Mhm.
that's a mistake, right? Because we've been given too much free will and too much control over our own circumstances. There are days when I would much rather be a puppet on the strings of my goddess than have to work shit out myself. You know what I mean?
Mm.
I would rather just love her and do what I'm told, but it doesn't
Mm.
work that way, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's not how we were created. We were created to think for ourselves and come to
Yeah.
our own conclusions. And sometimes I think, because I have developed, and I haven't had this that long, but I have developed that, there's this very clear voice in my head, which is not always the same voice, but I always know it's her voice and
Right.
not my own,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so I will often, I will ask for things like that. I'll be like, can you please just be in charge? And I can hear that voice say, no, because the reason you're here is to seek me. And if I were in charge of that, you wouldn't have that, experience. I mean, I think we are
Yes.
meant to be seekers, and as seekers to understand that you can't get it wrong and you'll never be done.
Right. 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 And that's probably the last thing that most people want, right? More unfinished work, right?
Right.
But yeah, I think
Because
you're
we
right.
are so indoctrinated into there's a finished product, there's a finish line, there's a
Mm.
deadline, there's a completion to be had. And
Yes.
every spirituality teaches us that no, that is just not where it's at. Like,
Yeah.
to be on your spiritual journey, you have to connect and allow yourself to be led in a general sense, but then beyond that, come to your own understanding. I know that my understanding of the goddess that I talk to, worship, pray to, commune with, scream, sing love songs to, that is my goddess. It isn't anyone
Mhm.
else's. It's not yours or hers or my wife's or anybody else. It may
Mhm.
share certain characteristics, but it is very personal to me. And it was personal to me when I, as a witch as well. You know what I mean?
Right.
It was very personal rather than, again, just this, the technical details of what are the ingredients I need to make this spell work. I mean, yes, that was part of it, but part of it was also, okay, so if this goddess were a human, what would her personality be? And then work with that. You know what I
Right.
mean? If it's a deity that I worship and I'm calling upon for help, I want to know what they're really like rather than just what they are a good tool for. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel that too. Like, I feel like Artemis has been in my life and pulling me for a long time, and patient, to be honest, because for a long time I denied the spiritual existence or the
Right.
spiritual connection. And now that I've published a book, and I have so many other books, I feel like that's the call is like, do it, do it, do it, put more stuff out,
Right.
like expose,
Right.
explore. And to a point where I'm like in a rush to, I'm like, I gotta do it, I gotta do it. And but I also feel a very personal connection
Right.
to her, in the sense that other people will tell me their connection to her, and it's not like mine, which is fine, which is the way it's meant to be. But
Right.
it's like, it's not like mine,
Right.
for sure. And perhaps that's what makes that spirituality so unique, because I think in monotheism the relationship is similar across the board, in a sense, right? Like, the expectation, even the personality of the god is written down. So
Right.
you all kind of, I mean, everything's written down too. I mean, Artemis, I guess, is written down, but I feel like, as a Catholic Christian, we felt like we all experienced the same God,
Right.
right? You know what I'm
Our
saying?
identification is the same, our iconography was the same,
Yeah,
our
you have an individual relationship, but it's to the same or similar God.
right.
Where to the goddess, you have more. You have an individual relationship, but almost to a unique version of your goddess
Right.
and you. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if that's accurate, but that's just the thought. I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah. Well, and not that long ago, and I don't remember if it was on TikTok or Instagram, but I made a post and I said, you've heard of a personal Jesus, maybe you need a girlfriend God instead, right? Like, I wish that, like, that's something that I think is very beautiful in traditional Christianity, right? Is that they do have
Mhm.
this very personal and deeply intimate relationship with Jesus. They don't have it
Agreed.
with God, but they do have it with
Yes,
Jesus. And I wish,
true. And Mary.
and Mary, right? I
True.
wish that people would, I don't know, develop. That's what I feel that I have done in my relationship with the goddess. And
Mhm.
I wish for others to do that, not because it's what I did, but because it is, I mean, it's like one of the most miraculous things I've ever had in my life. I'll tell you, Carla,
It's fulfilling.
I worry about very little these days. And that was not always the case because I'm a worrier. Like, that's an inherent trait
Right.
that I have from
Right.
my very close ancestors, you know, um,
Right. Right.
who are either still alive or haven't been gone very long. Um, and I don't know, it brings me such comfort, and I can't, like, I'm not all about toxic positivity, right? You kind of alluded to
Right.
that
Right.
earlier, but I am about, you know what, you have this whole magical, witchy, if you will, mystical, spiritual experience that you're missing out on because you're over here obsessing about the material world. Like, there's no acknowledgement that I have a spiritual life in addition to my material life, right? Or
Mm.
that those two things are mutually exclusive, but they're not. I mean, I can view my finances through a spiritual lens. I can view anything through a spiritual
Mm-hmm.
lens. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like I said, I want that for people just because it brings me such comfort.
Yes.
When I talk about how I can, I've reached this place where I can literally feel her hand on my shoulder. It's the, you know what I mean? Like, of course I would want that for everybody. It's amazing. And
Yes.
it makes me unafraid, and it makes me secure in my own skin. You know what I mean? It's given me a
Yes.
tremendous amount of self-confidence, not from a place of ego, but from a place of knowing that I am loved and lovable. And I
Yes.
am always, and have always been, am now, always will be, because I know that she loves me, and there is no greater love than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm not there yet,
I know. It's all right. It's
but
all right.
I admire that, and I could see that possibility for sure.
Well, and
Um,
obviously I have a lot more free time on my hands than most people do. But I mean, I did work, right? I
yeah,
did
yeah,
work. So,
of
and I
course.
made
You
time
can
for it
work and have,
then. I
but
just have a lot more time for it now,
yeah,
because it does take some effort to get to that place and to open your mind, that this
yeah,
other unearthly realm does exist.
yeah, yeah. It's the daily rituals too, right? And the daily moments.
Yes. And one of the reasons why I don't practice witchcraft a lot anymore is because I really started to understand that although I think the gods and goddesses that we work with in witchcraft are appreciative of our efforts, most of the pageantry of witchcraft really is for us. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like, if I believe that my life is magical in every waking moment, I don't need to do a ritual with a lot of tools or spell ingredients to prove the validity of that. You know what I mean? If
makes
anything,
sense.
I think spell casting is something that boosts that energy, right? Of what you seek or what you desire, or conversely, what you don't want or don't desire.
Mm-hmm.
But I no longer believe that it's entirely necessary,
Mm-hmm.
because I believe my goddess knows what is in my heart and my soul, and knows more about me than I ever will,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I trust her to lead me down paths. I trust wholeheartedly that she has my best interest at heart,
Mm-hmm.
and that she obviously knows more than I do. And that if I just stop resisting, it's
Mm-hmm.
life is so much easier for me when I'm in the flow. And I'm only in the
Yes.
flow. I talk about the flow all the time, but I'm only in the flow when I am consciously connected to her, right? Like, it started with only being able to do that, to like reach that level of connection, when I'm in the shower, right? Because I always have deep, profound spiritual experiences in the shower. I don't know why. That's just how it is. So
Okay.
from there, I had to learn how to bring that, the feeling of that connection and how it empowered me. I learned to take that, out of the shower and into my house. And then I learned
Right.
how to take it out of my house and into the world. And then I
Right.
learned how to take it, not just when I'm alone with her, but when I'm with other people. You know what I mean? To have that, to feel that presence right here, and feel that, silver thread or whatever magical thing that might be, and to trust that it's with me all the time. Now, obviously, I'm not perfect at that, but that has taken a lot of effort and a lot of time to be able to get to that place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's got to be a way, right? I mean, people can't just not have this experience until they're retired or disabled.
I don't know, because it depends on priorities, right? And
Mhm.
quality of life and people's
It does.
choices.
It does depend on priorities, but I think it also depends on openness, because it has
Mm-hmm.
been so trained into us to not believe in such things,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
you know,
Yes. Yes.
and
Yeah.
thinking of, and the other disservice of, you know, Catholicism and that kind of, the people behaving accordingly to their own moral code, not because they want to be a good person, but because they fear punishment.
Yes.
That mentality is only going to get you so far, and it's never going to feel rewarding or loving, right? I
Yes.
mean, the goddess is all about love,
Yes.
and
It's true.
love is what is at the root of most spirituality, as is community. I heard a few weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
in a lecture on YouTube, and he said any spiritual path that does not include being of service to others is ultimately doomed to fail, or at least have limitations, right? And
Yes.
that belief of we are all one, that is a belief that I think is probably an ancient belief, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
We are all
Agreed.
one. We are connected to everything in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do not only for the good of ourselves, but for the good of our world, for the good of our tribe, for the good of our culture, right? And we've
Yeah.
lost that, I think. But so would you say, I mean, that kind of mentality is certainly, would you say that that is obviously present in ancient goddess worship?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there is actually, there's no disconnection
Right,
between the natural world, the divine world, the ritual practice of the humans. In the ancient world, there is no disconnection. There's none. It is a complete sort of bubble, cosmic circle. Yeah.
right. It's like its
Yeah.
own spiritual ecosystem,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly. That's
Yeah,
a good word. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because everything bleeds. The festivals come for a certain time of the year, for a certain celebration that is connected to nature or fertility or
right,
whatever. And the gods play a role, the humans play a role, the animals being sacrificed play a role, everything plays a role. The food, the kind of food plays a role. Like, so it's so intertwined that you can't really take it apart.
right,
Yeah.
right,
And so it feels good. It feels right. It feels natural. Right.
right. And it's intuitive. I mean, so much of it was intuitive.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
before we had things like research and books and libraries, and
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Talk about, well,
Yeah.
do what feels right to you. That used to be
Yeah.
all we did, right? It was
Yeah.
instinct above reasoning or logic, or you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It just,
Yeah.
and I do believe that, um, I think I may have mentioned this before, reading this book on pagan ethics, and in the introduction, it essentially says that from the moment that man separated himself from nature, we've kind of been on this collision course where we're at now ever since,
Yes.
because
Yes.
we have
I
forgotten.
agree. Yes. Yes. That's a
Because I
statement
think
I
that
think we're
everything that we're
support.
talking about, that knowledge is inherent in us,
Yes.
right? So I really do think that spiritual development of the kind that we're talking about, you have to be open to it, and we're just so closed off from that, especially here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's such
Mm-hmm.
a young country, right? Everything came from somewhere else. And
Yeah.
today, like, people want to talk about cultural appropriation, and I realize that that is something that needs to be discussed when it comes to things like goddess worship. You know what I mean? Like, we have culturally appropriated everything from someone that came
Yeah.
before us, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's true. Yeah.
Like, there's just an example from witchcraft is, there's often a debate about what kind of sage we should and shouldn't use,
Mm.
because it's cultural appropriation, especially of Native American cultures. So
Wow.
yeah, so there is some reverence to that, but sage is really the only thing I can think of off the top of my head where we're like, yeah, you
Right.
really shouldn't do that because it's sacred to whatever. That's why I think Caribbean traditions and East African traditions and like the whole hoodoo, voodoo, that I'm glad that all of those are closed traditions, right? I think that's the mistake of having open traditions when it comes to any kind of witchcraft or of altering energy in the interest of achieving something. That's where I think the information is probably much purer in closed traditions like that, because it has been handed down from generation
Right.
to generation to
Right.
generation, and it isn't written down anywhere.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
That's yeah, I could go on and on and on, but I know it's getting late. It's getting late.
Yeah.
So it's kind of about witchcraft and goddesses.
It is. It is. I mean, we could we could do this again
Right.
every now and then and talk about different sort of almost trends that are going on.
Well, I'm hoping that as I continue to have more guests on the show, that at some point down the road, I can have episodes that are more like a panel discussion.
Yeah,
About
that's fun.
things like witchcraft and goddesses.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
And bring in that mix of academic research and emotional spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and
That would be
what I envision is everyone on a headset around some virtual table, and we're going to tell you the things that we've experienced, and you're going to tell us why that is, whatever it is totally inaccurate. In a nice way, of
right.
course.
Right. Yeah, that sounds good. I like that idea.
Hey, thanks for listening. New episodes drop every Saturday, so keep tuning in. You can also find The Girlfriend God on social media, both on TikTok and Instagram, hashtag The Girlfriend God, hashtag The Girlfriend God Podcast. Again, thanks for listening, liking, sharing, and following.